Well, let's hop in, Leslie. It's wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much for taking a minute out today.
Thank you for having me on. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about Fission and my writing.
I love it. So let's begin our journey with the question I've tried to get away from, but it was such a big part of our lives, and it was COVID. And 5 years ago, we were all going through this change. Everything about our lives were changing. How did you make it through that pandemic, and how has it affected either your writing or the way that you do things today?
Well, I felt very lucky in a lot of ways. I mean, the unlucky thing is that I'm about to turn 73. So even in the pandemic, I knew I was in a high risk group and I'd better be very careful.
Yeah.
But the lucky thing, in a way, is that I lived by myself in a four-bedroom home, and I kept, seeing all the stories of people crammed into their little apartments. And I felt so lucky to be able to have all that space to myself, and me and the dog were safe. And I do have a son who lives in New York City, so I was always worrying about him, and it was tough, not to be able to visit him as often as I would like. And I managed to get through the whole pandemic without ever getting COVID, although I
Wow.
got it last year.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I hear there's a surge. It's still going on, but I think it's
Yeah.
more classified as kind of a flu more than anything else.
Yeah, and the case I had was mild too, luckily. So,
Yeah.
and how has it changed my life now? I think denial, we always say denial is a river in Africa, right?
Yeah.
But I think denial cuts in, and we often don't think so much about those days. They seem kind of like a blur. But I think it made me perhaps more isolated than I had been before. And I did, change things in my profession during that time. I had an online company called Will to Love that was for cancer patients who were having problems with their sex lives or fertility, kind of an educational and counseling web-based company, and I ended up closing it in the beginning of 2021. It was a hard slog, and that was kind of the death knell for it.
Yeah.
And I started doing more private practice by telehealth. I'm a clinical psychologist by profession. So that also helped me stay connected to people and gave me something to do. And I can't remember exactly when I started writing novels. I think it was at least by 2022. So that changed a lot too, because now that's a lot of my time.
Yeah, for sure. So let's get into this career that you had as a psychologist and now as an author and a speaker. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to put you in front of a bunch of grade school kids, let's say 12 years old. It's career day, and they want to know what you've done in your career. And they ask you, how do you answer them?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I read somewhere, and I can't remember who it was that said it, that creative people have an average of three careers in their lives. And I like to think that that's been true for me because I decided to be a psychologist when I was around a senior in high school, and I was straight arrow. I went straight through my undergraduate and 5 years of graduate school, and then a postdoctoral fellowship, and into my research and practice, and that was, my career for most of my life. But I always had loved writing, and I started writing self-help books as a psychologist. So I've actually published four nonfiction books before I ever started writing fiction. And I took creative writing in college, and it was always something I wanted to get back to. So when I retired from my academic career and then closed my startup, which was maybe my second creative career, I turned to writing fiction. And I went back to uh, some events in my own life in my first novel, which hasn't been published so far. And then I picked up these family stories for my second novel. So it all kind of tied together in a way.
Yeah. So take me back to when you were 12 years old. What was your dream life? What did you want to do?
I wanted to be an archaeologist.
Okay.
Uh, I read a book when I was about 6 or 7. I was an early reader, and it was a book called The Lost Queen of Egypt. And I've heard other people say it also was a seminal book for them, but it was the story of the wife of Tutankhamun. And it really gripped me. And so I, like, kids have dinosaur eras. I had an Egyptology era from about 7 to 13. And I read every book on Egypt in the children's library, and the librarian said, "Oh, I think you're ready for the adult library now." So I realized as I got into middle school and later that I really didn't want to dig around in the dirt with potsherds and scorpions. I liked history, but I switched to maybe anthropology as an ideal, and then I decided on psychology. So it kind of evolved through the social sciences, getting closer to the present.
Yeah, for sure. So take me back to where you were born and raised. What were the foundational elements of writing and this fascination with psychology that's evolved into this career that you have?
Well, I was born and raised in the Chicago area, and my parents were both very bright and driven people who didn't have college degrees, as we'll talk about more if we talk about fission.
Yeah.
And they instilled kind of a love of learning, I think, in my sister and me. And there were always books, tons of books in our house. My dad was a science fiction fan, so we always had Astounding magazine and things like that. And I was, just encouraged. They read to me as a child at bedtime, which I also did with my own son until he told me, "Mom, I can read Harry Potter by myself. You're too slow." So so books and writing were always important. When I was in college, I took a lot of creative writing courses, and my mother, who was a very practical person, she was an accountant, wanted me to have a profession where I could earn a good living. She didn't want me to be dependent on a man either. She was an early feminist. So she was really worried about my writing. And she said, "You're never going to be a fiction writer. Fiction writers are like Truman Capote. He wrote his first novel when he was really young, and he was just totally absorbed in writing, and you're not like that. So you shouldn't, think that you're going to be a writer," which didn't really make, I knew why she was saying it, so it didn't make a big impression. But I also loved psychology enough at that age to pick it as my professional direction.
So let's talk about Fission. Talk to me a little bit about, you kind of talked about your parents. Talk to me a little bit about the story and how the book finally came to fruition.
Sure. I always knew that my parents had been in Oak Ridge during the Manhattan Project. The story was that my mom was an undergrad at the University of Chicago, and they eloped before Pearl Harbor. And she saw a quack gynecologist who told her she was infertile. So she got pregnant immediately because they weren't taking precautions. And she had to drop out of college, which was a big blow to her. And they were only 19 and 22 when they married. So there she was, a 20-year-old mother of a sickly premature baby. And my dad was recruited to be an electronics technician for the Manhattan Project, first at the University of Chicago and then at Oak Ridge. And my mother followed him, and leaving my sister for a few months with her parents because my sister was a toddler at the time. And Oak Ridge was built extremely fast, and there was a huge housing shortage. So when they first went down there, they had to live in sex separated dorms until their house was ready. And at that point, my mother went back to Chicago and got my sister. So they had all kinds of crazy stories about what life was like in Oak Ridge. And I always wanted to do something with them. And I think I really got inspired. I wanted to videotape my dad, who died in 2007, but sadly, he had a catastrophic fall, and he was too ill to really do that at the end of his life. So in around 2019, I saw an article in the New York Times about a previously unknown spy in Oak Ridge. He was a young electronics engineer who belonged to what they called the Special Engineer Detachment, which were a bunch of brainy GIs who were recruited and put to work on the Manhattan Project. But he happened to come from a first generation Jewish immigrant family like my dad did, and he was a communist. And so he sent secrets from Oak Ridge and later on other sites in the Manhattan Project to the Soviets. And I thought, wow, he worked in the same building as my dad. He, and and I wonder if my dad knew him. And then in 2021, a author named Anne Hagedorn wrote a nonfiction book called Sleeper Agent about a very similar second Soviet atomic spy in Oak Ridge who was also in the SED, also worked in the same building as my dad, also came from a very similar family background, and was a radiation safety officer. And my dad had an accidental radiation exposure early in the Manhattan Project. And that made me wonder even more, especially with a whole book about this guy, whether they might have known each other. So, since I will never know that, I came up with a plot for a novel combining my parents' real stories about everyday life in Oak Ridge with a lot of fiction. And part of the fiction is that the couple who are similar to my mom and dad in the novel are the heroine and the hero. The wife meets this army engineer and is attracted to him, and he tries to seduce her to get her to divulge some of the secrets that she might know about the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
So that became a more dramatic core for a novel because people's everyday stories are interesting, but that's a memoir, not a novel.
Yeah, absolutely. What a great story. So let me ask you this. Who has been that inspiration for you in your career, not only as a psychologist, but as a writer, that heroic force for you?
Gee, I'm not sure if I could name one person like that
Yeah.
who's been an inspiration. There have been so many inspirations along the way. I did have a great experience recently. There's an author, when I started writing this novel, I started reading all the novels I could get my hands on about the Manhattan Project, and I found over 20 of them. It's been a popular topic. And
Yeah.
there was one novel that I especially liked called Atomic Love by an author named Jenny Fields. And so after I had finished my novel, when it was time to try to get authors to give you blurbs, little comments for the book cover and things, I emailed her and she was kind enough to respond to me because she's a pretty well-known author and nobody knows about me in the fiction world. So it took a while, but she recently read the book and she really loved it and just gave me a really nice blurb for it. So that was a lot of validation for me.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm curious. I've always enjoyed psychology since I was in high school and through college. It's always been something that's fascinated me, just the way the human mind works and how we dip into the subconscious and conscious and how it all manifests. What was the most, when you look back on your career, what was the most interesting thing you realized about humans that you didn't know going into it as a psychology, professional?
Well, it's you might think it would be something about sexuality because I'm a trained sex therapist and my specialty was, cancer patients and how they deal with problems in their sex lives and fertility. But I would say the thing that really surprised me a little and really pu- gave me the biggest impression is that I spent 21 years at MD Anderson, the big cancer center in Houston. And
Yeah.
even though I was doing a lot of research and not that much clinical work during that time, what I saw were the way that families respond when one of their members gets ill. And I saw how many really functional families there are. As psychologists, we tend to see people when they're at their lowest, when they have problems. But when you work in a medical setting, you see a whole range of people. And it really made me, it kind of warmed my heart and made me feel really good about how supportive most families are when they're going through something so difficult.
You know, I remember a statistic about the United Way. I ran a campaign for them one year, and I remember they said that people that have the least amount of money give the most. And
That
it's
would surprise me.
Yeah, it's that level of humanity, like you say. There's something about people that rally around when there's hurricanes. I mean, like Katrina was 20 years ago. When those kinds of things happen, it's you realize the girth of the human heart. People do actually rally and band together in ways. But it's so deceiving because in our modern society, they show us as so polarized between right and left, and there's all this gray matter that exists in between that we all float in.
Yes, and unfortunately, the thing that really gets highlighted these days and makes me really sick at heart is the cruelty and corruption that we see in our country.
I I never thought we would get to this point where that would be something that would be just okay. That anybody in this country would just go along with some kind of level of that lineage. And it's like we've just it not me. I mean, clearly
Yeah,
not you, but there's a lot of people that find it okay. And it's like, I think the thing to me that's the saddest is that it's this measuring mark for children. It's really kind of embedding these seeds in their brains of watching this vitriol that's going on, this dramatic theater that's like saying, "Oh, well, it's okay. You got convicted, but you're okay. You're out." Or we're not going to do this even though we know it's right. It's those things the kids are grabbing onto, and this is the successive generations that are going to lead democracies and other organizations, and it's really weird. A surreal reality.
yeah, it's really upsetting. And the racism and the otherism in our country. And I guess one thing I cynically think about humans, as well as the kindness and the goodness within families, is that we are tribal creatures. And a lot of humans feel like they have to have somebody to look down on. And if you look at the course of history, a lot of the most horrible wars and cruelty are fought over making somebody the inhuman other and then attacking them. And I see that very much happening these days, and it's really sickening.
It is. It's an interesting way of breaking it down because I see that. I mean, even in little ways of like popularity that we go after, whether it's music or the people that really go viral, it's like, are you kidding me? There's just these viral moments with people where it's like they just don't really have talent or they shouldn't be there, and society is just put them on their shoulders. It's a very, very strange time. And I don't want to be that older guy and say that. I'm a Gen Xer. I'm 52, and I never want to get pigeonholed into, lamenting what it used to be like, but there really is a level of our modern world right now that's gone into a direction that I think young and old alike can agree that it's very surreal and it's not okay.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. And I I'm not sure that I think it's so much that you should just look at the recent past, but I think you have to look across history
True.
and see that eras like this come up repeatedly. It's like a cycle.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Being in psychology, you have to dig into some dark corners of human thought and behavior. How did you protect yourself and ground yourself and take care of your own soul, yet do a great job at what you were doing? What was that collective energy that got you out of bed every day to do that?
Well, I suppose, I had a fair amount of personal therapy myself, and I was in a pretty privileged position because most of my career, my clinical work was a small portion of my hours of the week, and I was doing a lot of research and writing. And I think it's tougher when you're immersed in clinical work, and especially if you're working with really difficult populations. And I certainly have seen a lot of difficult things, people dying of cancer and incest survivors and all that kind of thing. But I think, you know, I had enough self-knowledge that I didn't feel like I was falling into that trauma by proxy kind of
Yeah,
thing that
yeah.
some mental health professionals experience. I will say that my parents, as much as I loved them and talked about some of their wonderful qualities, had a pretty lousy marriage. And like a lot of children, my mother confided in me a little bit too much and tried to kind of put me in the middle. And I really think that that was one of the things that led to my interest in being a psychologist and being a couples therapist in particular, that wish that I could somehow fix things. And of course, we can't always fix things. My parents were married for 50 years, and I know they loved each other, but they made each other pretty miserable at times too.
But you made a very interesting point that I think sometimes we pick professions that may by osmosis heal us and make us better and stronger because it really is a two-way avenue. Even though you're a psychologist and you're helping the patient, there's things that are going to happen that are going to completely be a part and affect you in very equal and profound ways.
Well, sure. I mean, I think that's true in any profession. And even
Yeah,
if we think about some of the miserable interactions that happen in the workplace when people aren't a mental health professional.
yeah,
So,
yeah, for sure. So let me ask you this. If you were to have a dream tonight, you ran into the 18-year-old version of you getting ready to charge out into the world and live your life, and you could give that version of you a piece of advice based on this life you've lived, the wisdom you've gained, what advice would you impart on that young version of you?
worry a lot less about how you look and a lot more about how many people you have around you that you love and love you.
Yeah, yeah. So let me ask you this. If you could get into a room of everybody that you've worked with throughout the years in various professional capacities, whether it's clients or colleagues, and you could walk to the middle of that room at a podium or the front of that room and you could tell them a fun story. Maybe the first concert you ever saw, maybe a seminal moment in your life, a great place you traveled to that you loved, your favorite memory of Chicago, some kind of fun story that would humanize you a little bit more to that room of people. What would be a great story, a fun story you would tell them?
Oh boy, does it, how explicit can we be?
You do what you're a noted psychologist. I trust your judgment.
Well, one fun story that I always remember from my early career when I was at MD Anderson is that in those days, if a man had cancer of the prostate or bladder and he lost his ability to have erections, the only treatment we had before Viagra and everything was to put in what they called an inflatable penile prosthesis, which is a little like a bionic device that allows a man to have an erection or not at
Yeah,
will.
yeah,
And we had a patient from South America who had had bladder cancer and he was scheduled for surgery. And I normally would talk to those patients and would also talk to their wives or partners. And he had told us that his wife was back in their home country. And so I was walking with the surgeon who was my mentor, and his daughter came up to us and said, "What on earth are you going to do to my father? My mother says she hasn't been with him in 20 years, and this isn't going to make any difference." And I said, and she said, "Are you the person who's going to do the surgery?" Pointing at me. And I said, "No, I'm just the psychologist, but I understand your mother's back home." And she said, "Oh, no, she's across the street at the hotel." And I said, "Well, before we go forward with this surgery, I think that I need to talk with both your parents." So we got this couple in, and the wife was this small lady in a black dress and black orthopedic shoes, and she only spoke Spanish, so we had to work with a lovely female interpreter. And we did this whole interview where it turned out that the husband was pathologically jealous and was sure that his wife was having an affair because he
wow.
had this problem. And she had a totally different idea of what was actually going to happen in the surgery, and the husband had been chronically unfaithful, which was basically a part of their culture.
Wow.
And she knew that when he had the surgery, he was going to go out and be unfaithful again. So trying to navigate through that couple with
Wow.
the interpreter, and we ended up. I was trying to be very creative, and I said, "When was the last time you brought your wife you told your wife you loved her?" And then the guy said, "Well, I don't know. I probably should do that more often." And the interpreter puts it in Spanish, "Bring her flowers." And by the end of the interview, they were reconciled, at least temporarily. I don't know how long it lasted,
Yeah.
but I always remembered that.
That's a great story. So, of all of these adventures and professional accolades that you've had in publishing your book, what are you ultimately the proudest of?
My son.
Yeah. Yeah. Good answer. Yeah.
Well, I can't. In a way, that's not right because he's a grown man and he's himself, and I can't be proud of him because he created himself with just a little help from me.
Yeah. I love it. So, let me ask you this. Everyone has a perception of you. Family, friends, all of your clients, colleagues, everyone that gets your book, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Oh boy. Um, there's a test called the Myers-Briggs that's a
Huh?
personality test that's online. Everybody takes it. And I've taken it a couple of times, and they always compare you to somebody. And I have an unusual profile, and the comparison is General Patton or Iron Maggie Thatcher.
Wow.
And that kind of surprised me when I got it back. And then I started thinking, I guess I've always been kind of an outspoken leader
Yeah.
type of person, although I like to think that I'm also empathic and kind and all those other things.
Yeah.
But I guess I I see myself as effective, somebody who gets things done.
So if anybody wants to pick up your wonderful book, Fission, if they want to reach out to you, any of your other work, anything else going on, where's the best place for them to go?
I have an author website. It's, leslieschoverauthor.com. The book will be out January 27th, but you can pre-order it now at wherever books are sold,
Okay.
basically.
Okay. I will put links in the show notes. Leslie, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for your story. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And best of luck on the release.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on your show.
You bet. Thank you.